Lisa Patel joins us from London. She is the CEO and co-founder of Istesso, a drug discovery and development company working to treat autoimmune diseases and cancer. Her company works on the cutting edge of an exciting new field of medicine called immunometabolism. Before joining Istesso in 2007, Lisa spent 10 years working at GlaxoSmithKlein as a team leader in the Cardiovascular Centre of Excellence and laterally as a group leader in clinical pharmacology and discovery medicine. Lisa earned a PhD in molecular genetics, a degree in biochemistry, and an MBA. She joins us today for a conversation about the exciting medical research her team is engaged in, as well as her professional journey to the top of such an innovative company. And with that, Lisa, we welcome you to the program.
Thank you very much for having me, Brian.
All right, let's begin by defining one of the big words I used in the intro, immunometabolism. Can you help break that down for our audience and give us a sense of what it means and why it matters?
Immunometabolism is really a kind of amalgamated word from two stems. Immuno, which refers to your immune system, and metabolism, which I think is a kind of concept that will be familiar to all of your listeners as the way that we use energy. So some research that's been emerging over the last 10 years shows that your immune cells really dependent on the way that they process energy for what they do. They need certain types of energy to use to do certain things. And in a disease like an autoimmune disease, that energy is really critical for fueling an attack that the immune system mounts on your tissues that can lead to really debilitating symptoms that patients who have those conditions experience. The science of applying immunometabolism really refers to trying to change the way that those cells use energy to change their behavior. I think we can understand that at a macro level by thinking about when you go into a restaurant, for example, and you see the menu, and you know that if you're going to have certain food choices, you might end up behaving in a slightly different way. If you maybe decided to eat the entire chocolate cake as opposed to eating the salad, you're obviously going to behave differently afterwards. What we do is just delete some of the things from the menu. We just say, immune cell, you're not going to use this today, and that changes the way that they behave.
How did you get into this particular field of medicine?
Actually a combination of serendipity and interest, I think. So my first degree is in biochemistry, and when you train as a biochemist, you receive this gigantic wall poster that shows you every single way in which a cell can metabolize energy. And a lot of the degree involves trying to remember that. So I had a kind of fundamental interest in the area of metabolism to begin with. Actually, when I went to GlaxoSmithKlein, I was also working in metabolism. So I was working in cardiovascular disease and metabolic diseases like diabetes. That cemented the kind of interest in applying biochemistry and an understanding of metabolism to drug discovery. And really, the immune system is king. So putting those two things together, it kind of became a natural home for me to work on the way that immune cells really process their energy.
What kind of history is there to this? It feels like we're hearing about this maybe publicly for the first time, but I imagine there's been research in this space. How new is this? How innovative is this? And how much research has been done, over the past 20 or so years?
The area of metabolism really enjoyed its heyday, I would say, in the 60s and the 70s. Most people who will have done any biology at school might have learned about an organelle that sits in the cell called the mitochondrion. And they probably would have learned that the mitochondrion is the powerhouse of the cell. It's a very standard kind of phrase that lots and lots of people will be able to remember from their school days. And that phrase really comes from that research in the 60s and 70s. Actually, after that, everyone thought that they really understood everything there was to know about metabolism. And it wasn't until probably the late noughties, early teenies, 2011, 2012, that a researcher in Ireland, Luke O'Neill, really made some strides into understanding how changing the way that metabolites and energy, ATP is the energy currency of the cell, flow through immune cells, can change their behavior. And it really, since then, that was a kind of profound change in the way that people thought about metabolism. And the field has taken off since then. Lots and lots of research now going on, trying to understand how different cells use different sources of energy and how that changes the way that the cells behave when they're inside your body.
Are there particular diseases or disorders that you believe this form of treatment will be advantageous over, let's call them traditional pharmaceuticals or whatever the standard medicines that are used against those diseases today? Are certain disorders more susceptible to being treated by this method than others?
Yes, so what we think is that this method has got profound implications for treating autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis or ulcerative colitis, but also a really second major category of diseases, which are called fibrotic diseases. And that includes diseases like lung fibrosis, lung scarring, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. That's actually a very cancer-like condition. So once you're diagnosed with it, you've got a median survival of 2 to 5 years. And actually, none of the existing drugs are going to improve your chance of surviving that particular disease. So we think that applying this particular technology, this science, is going to have profound impacts for patients who've got that disease, also autoimmune diseases.
Are those diseases, and so pardon my and my audience's probably ignorance to those, are those diseases that have effective treatments today, or are the treatments today currently merely maintenance? And what you're proposing that this form of treatment, this immunometabolism, could be more of a cure as opposed to simply stabilizing?
Let me take each of the kind of categories of disease in turn. In autoimmune disease, there are lots and lots of drugs that are available to actually treat those diseases. So if we take rheumatoid arthritis as an example, rheumatoid arthritis, your immune system is attacking your joints and you become progressively disabled. There are over 15 drugs that are available, approved by the FDA to treat rheumatoid arthritis. But maybe what people don't really know is that these drugs largely work in the same way. So they're all doing, at the biological level, a very, very similar thing. And as a consequence, actually, over 40% of patients who have rheumatoid arthritis can't have their symptoms controlled with the existing drugs. So they're really not being treated at all. Of the 60% who do respond, actually 80% won't achieve more than a 70% improvement in their condition. That's a lot of percentages. I guess the summary is that most patients who've got rheumatoid arthritis will receive a drug that actually be paying quite a lot of money for it, and they won't be getting profoundly better. They won't be feeling as though they've been cured of their condition. Immunometabolism offers some major advantages over those existing drugs. So firstly, it should be able to help those 40% of patients who don't respond. But secondly, and really importantly, it actually offers the potential to reverse the underlying condition. So we think that it gives us the potential to fix the cause of the disease within your joints so that ultimately you can get to the position where you feel as though you are cured. If we go to pulmonary fibrosis, lung scarring, there are 2 drugs available at the moment to treat that disease. They actually just slow how quickly you get worse. So your rate of decline. So if you imagine you're a patient with lung fibrosis, what's happening to you is actually day by day you're suffocating. Your lungs are losing their ability to exchange oxygen from the air. And it gets worse every day, and the drugs just make it get worse a little bit more slowly. What immunometabolism offers is actually the potential to start fixing the underlying scarring and to stabilize patients where they are, or ultimately, ideally, the ambition would be to actually make them completely cured.
When you think about the application of this form of treatment to something as complex as cancer, I know you didn't mention that specifically as one of the targets, but I have read that this is an area of potential. What research is there today that demonstrates whether immunometabolism can be used against common forms of cancer? And maybe as a leader in this space, what is your view? Are you optimistic that this can be someday, or is that a more of a stretch application of immunometabolism treatments?
Yes, a really interesting question. So I think maybe you and a lot of your listeners might have heard of the next generation cancer therapies that are really creating profound benefits for patients, the immunotherapies, drugs like Keytruda and Opdivo. And those drugs are really able to elicit cures in a large number of patients. In the patients who don't respond, one really emerging piece of new science is showing that the immune cells that these drugs target suffer from something called T cell exhaustion. Essentially, they just become too tired. Their metabolism isn't able to support the kind of level of attack they need to mount on a tumor. And so we think, and there's some really interesting papers coming out, that by reprogramming metabolism and reprogramming the metabolism of these T cells who are feeling exhausted, we can increase the effectiveness of these immunotherapies and get more people being cured. So that science is really at its emerging stage at the moment, and I think it's got enormous potential to make a difference in cancer. But the application of it is really at the very early stages. I think we're probably talking 5 or 6 years off before we see something approved.
Is your company the first to be creating treatments that you're seeking to bring to market, or are there others in this field who have either successfully brought something in the immunometabolism space to market, or who are peers of yours who might be working on different disease sets or different research?
Yep, so we are the leading company in applying immunometabolism to chronic diseases like autoimmunity and fibrosis. There are a number of companies who are working in the cancer metabolism space, so companies like Cornerstone Pharmaceuticals or Raphael Pharmaceuticals are working in cancer metabolism more specifically, and they're also at an advanced stage of development. But Istesso is certainly leading the way in terms of autoimmunity and fibrosis.
So let's talk about. I know you have something that you're working on. You mentioned earlier for rheumatoid arthritis. Can you explain
Mhm.
that specifically, where that is in its trials or its research phase? Again, pardon me for not having all of the perfect lingo of the industry, but where is that in its development? And specifically, how does that differ from some of the just existing drugs in the market? I think you mentioned earlier some of the key potential differences, but curious about that specific drug that you're all working on today, what you have seen so far in these early stages.
So, our lead drug is a compound called MBS 2320, and it's in phase 2 clinical trials for the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis. That phase 2 study is about halfway through and will finish in the first half of 2024. So, MBS 2320 reprograms mitochondrial metabolism. It actually changes the behavior of these subcellular organelles, the mitochondria, that I mentioned earlier, used to be called the powerhouse of the cell. It actually turns out the mitochondria are much more than a powerhouse that just creates energy. They're more like a kind of information processor. So they receive signals and then they transmit kind of directions across the cell that tells the cell to behave in different ways. So when MBS 2320 hits the mitochondria, it changes the metabolism of that organelle. That results in a number of key benefits that we see that we've seen in early clinical trials and that we aim to show as the product develops. So firstly, it controls the symptoms of disease, and it does that as well as the existing drugs. So those are really very commercially successful drugs, like Humira or Enbrel as examples. So symptom control is there, number one. Number two, it stops the progression of the disease. So as a patient with rheumatoid arthritis, you'll have what's called erosions in your bone. These are holes that form within your bones, and that's where your immune cell is really attacking. It's saying, oh, there's a problem here. Let me go in and fix it. It's attacking what it perceives to be some damage. It doesn't just perceive it, it is damage. So MBS 2320 stops that from continuing. Your holes don't get any bigger. It does both of those things without something called immunosuppression. So if you take one of the existing drugs like Humira or Enbrel that I mentioned earlier, these act by suppressing your immune system. Effectively, what they say is, we're going to control your disease, but we're going to do it by turning off your immune function. That means that you become more susceptible to infections and more susceptible to certain types of cancers. MBS 2320 doesn't have those issues. It doesn't suppress your immune system. It's very, very specific to just stopping the attack from your disease. But actually, maybe more profoundly than any of those other things, MBS 2320 does something really unique. What we see when we look inside the damaged tissues is evidence that the tissue is starting to remodel itself. The underlying tissue is actually starting to create a response that means that the tissue becomes more normal looking. We think in the long term, that's something that's going to lead to a complete resolution of the disease, because if you can fix things at the underlying level, ultimately there's nothing for your immune system left to do. And you should be able to go back to living a healthy, symptom-free life.
That is exciting stuff. So you said that you're in a phase 2 now. For the benefit of our audience who may not understand the full cycle of a drug approval, so if phase 2 continues on and goes well and you get those results in 2024, what would the next stage of approval look like?
The next stage will be phase 3, which is the final stage of clinical trials. Those are really, really big global studies that are conducted worldwide, US, Europe, Asia, and that would typically take 2 to 3 years before the drug will be submitted for approval to the FDA.
Excellent. So we're looking at a 2027 timeline?
27, 28. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. So let's talk about anything else, and we don't want to break any NDAs or anything like that. So to the degree that you can, talk about any other treatments that you all may either have in the pipeline or things that look like they're interesting and promising that may be earlier in the research cycle.
So we have a second compound that will be going into the first stage of human clinical trials next year. It's called MBS 2687. And that also reprograms mitochondrial metabolism, but slightly differently to MBS 2320. And we think that that drug's got really profound potential in diseases of neuroinflammation, so multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's disease, but also in fibrosis as well, so lung fibrosis, liver fibrosis, and kidney fibrosis.
And that would work in much the way that the mechanism would work in much the same way as what you mentioned, the mechanism against rheumatoid arthritis, reprogramming the mitochondria of the cell to fundamentally change its interactions that may be the underlying cause of those diseases.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So really going to the mitochondria and getting the mitochondria to redivert signals so that the cells stand down and attack and actually start a repair cycle. So the immune system is very important in causing repair of tissues.
You have talked about, in the context of these treatments, their application against autoimmune diseases, and then we mentioned earlier there's always the potential that the similar technology could be used against something like cancer. Are there any other possible applications for these drugs for non-autoimmune or non-cancerous diseases?
That's a really interesting question. Thought-provoking. Do you know, the immune system is really involved in such a wide spectrum of diseases, even the diseases that are not considered autoimmune in a classical way. So something like lung fibrosis has an autoimmune, not an autoimmune, has an immune component to it. But certainly neurological diseases, those are not classically considered to be autoimmune diseases. This approach should have a profound benefit in those sorts of conditions. And then some really rare conditions, things like motor neurone disease or Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, are also areas where we would hope that application of this science would really elicit some strong benefits.
Are there any known side effects to this treatment or perhaps anticipated just given the nature of how it works?
Yep, so in our clinical trials so far, MBS 2320 has actually been really profoundly safe. We haven't seen any serious what we call adverse effects. And actually, in our last clinical trial in rheumatoid arthritis, we saw a reduction in infection rate in the patients who received MBS 2320 compared with those who didn't, which really supports our argument that the drug is not going to cause that immunosuppression I talked about with existing drugs. At very high doses, the drug can cause some transient nausea, but really we haven't seen that at the doses that we'll use therapeutically. So overall, it's actually a very encouraging profile at the moment in terms of safety.
Now, a treatment like this that has the potential to have such a transformational impact for patients around the world, in theory, who have so many of the diseases that we've talked about, would seem to have a dramatic, positive impact on healthcare systems and, even on government programs that fund medical care. Do you think that if the research pans out in the years to come, this is the sort of drug that could get fast tracked, at least for compassionate use and maybe for special cases for people who are further along in their diseases? I don't know that it would get fast tracked for full approval. I don't know how many things get that anymore, but it
Mm.
certainly feels like it has that potential. Do you think it falls into one of those categories of true breakthrough treatments?
So for the treatment of lung fibrosis, where I mentioned there's an extremely high mortality rate, MBS 2320 has been awarded a fast track designation by the FDA. So this kind of unique biology has already been recognized to an extent, and we hope that that means that we can accelerate its progression to approval. And certainly that fast track designation comes with an obligation to consider compassionate use when requested. In rheumatoid arthritis, I think certainly if we're able to show profound effects in terms of the progression of the disease, it's something that we would definitely discuss with regulators in terms of trying to get it to patients really as fast as we possibly could.
Are there any skeptics of this particular field of immunometabolism? And if so, what are some of the common questions that you faced going into this, or that your drugs would face from perhaps those who for one reason or another have some doubts about this particular approach?
Well, that's an interesting question, Brian. I think actually, the scientific progress is a series of debates, isn't it? Where uh, someone may come up with an idea and it gets challenged, and you debate it and you generate more data and you discuss it further. I would say that actually the main skepticism about the field of immunometabolism is that no one has shown that it works in phase 3 clinical trials yet. And there's no arguing with that. No one has shown that this approach can benefit patients in a large scale clinical trial. We really hope, we have the ambition that our phase 3 clinical trials, when we get there, will prove that the science is right and lead to a series of new therapies coming to the market. It will be really the first thing that tells people that this is a route that they can take. And I would expect that there'll be an increasing amount of interest if we're able to do that.
So let's talk about you a little bit more and how you came to lead this company, Istesso, ended up in this field. You gave us a little bit of a background on how you started your professional career. You spent 10 years in what we in the United States would call the big pharma industry, the GlaxoSmithKlein.
Mhm.
Obviously, did some important and great work there. But at some point, you made the decision that you wanted to pursue something outside of what that company was focused on, and you were going to branch out and break off on your own. Help our audience walk us through what that thought process was like for you and what ultimately made you decide to strike out on your own.
Yeah, you know, I have got such happy memories of being at GSK. That's a company where um, all of my colleagues were so focused on getting things to the market for patients, and it was an incredible learning experience about the industry and about the way that things can be done. From a very young age, I was quite entrepreneurial. I always had ideas for businesses that I could start. And I always had the ambition to do something different. Um, in a large pharmaceutical company, that can sometimes be a challenge because of the power of the organizational setup. So 10 years in, I felt I'd really learned as much as I probably could at that time, and decided to move into biotech. And I met my co-founder of Istesso, a guy called Sam Williams, who comes from a venture capital investment banking background. And we started working on this small project that was unusual, but where the biology and the science looked really, really interesting. And the field of immunometabolism actually at that time did not exist. All we saw was that there was some very interesting science and that it looked very, very different to anything that I'd certainly ever seen before. And we just followed that step by step. It was a real bootstrapped approach, just doing one experiment at a time, seeing what happened, doing another experiment. And I used to spend a lot of time at the British Library because we were a lean organisation. It was really just me within it for some time. Over time, as we learned more, we realised that there was something very, very exciting happening. And at the same time, the field of immunometabolism really started to take off. And we realized we were at kind of the intersection of the application of this new science and business. And that's really how we got to where we were. But the change for me was really to move away from the comfort of a big pharmaceutical company and to take the risk that I'd be able to get everything I needed from the British Library, which luckily I was with some friends, with some help from some friends.
I was going to say, how critical was it that you had a team around you, whether it was formal or informal, to both support what you were doing, but also to be actual resources for you to help with some of the work that went into the early stages of setting up Istesso?
Yeah, so I was really lucky actually that when we first started out, I had so many friends at Glaxo who are still my friends. And when something was really tricky, I would phone them and I would just say, "But how do I do this? You know, walk me through the way that I think about this." And those informal networks, being able to seek advice from people who've got experience, I think were absolutely critical in making sure that we were successful in the early years. Um, as the company has grown, we've developed actually a team of really experienced pharmaceutical company experts who now work independently of their alma maters. Um, and that network really is Istesso. Although I'm in the middle of it, really the knowledge and the thinking um, is a disseminated process that requires these over 30 different experts from different disciplines to come together and to create something innovative.
So that requires a different leadership style, certainly than in a larger corporate structure with defined hierarchies and so forth. Talk to me about the process of adjusting your leadership strategy to startup mentality, network style, maybe opposed to what you experienced in the big pharma space or other roles that you'd held before that. What does it take to lead a biotech startup, and how have you learned to manage that structure? What are some of the tips and advice that you might give to people who are thinking about following a similar path?
So you're absolutely right. The leadership style is completely different to the kind of hierarchical direct reporting structure. Within GlaxoSmithKlein, it was very easy to say, this is what I want done, and then ask people to do it, and it would get done by a deadline. In the disseminated model at Istesso, particularly working with consultants, you don't own their time. And so the number one change that I learned that I would need to make was to really focus on building the strong relationships with members of my team. That's really important in helping them to understand exactly what I'm asking for, but also making sure that where they have conflicting priorities, they're getting asked to do work by other companies, I hopefully float to the top. So it's very collegiate, it's very collaborative, and it's very much about those interpersonal relationships. In terms of advice, please carry on.
No, please go ahead.
In terms of advice for people who might be starting out in biotech and what it takes, I think if I may give 3 pieces of advice. Number 1, secure some funding. Make sure that you can see through a defined period of time, and make sure you build in some buffer in case an experiment doesn't quite work out in the way that you're expecting it to. Number 2, persist. It's really, really hard making a drug, and nothing is going to go right first time. And you just have to get your nose down and keep going. And number 3, don't be scared of saying that you don't know. Get as much advice as you possibly can from people who've done it before, and that will pay you back 1,000 times compared to trying to go it alone.
Let me tackle that first one with you a little further, securing funding. So this is one of the keys in any area of research. I'm curious in your case what that pursuit looked like, and if you're starting out and perhaps you are in an even more nascent field, less proven field of biotech, and there is going to be skepticism, if you feel that pursuing certain sources of funding is better in this field than others, given the exchange of either equity or control that certain sources might seek, or even a level of support that you can expect. I'm curious about your thoughts about those sources of funding, specifically in the biotech space, and maybe even more specifically in the truly nascent areas of that field.
So I would say that there can be a tendency when you're really starting out to feel as though you're lucky to be getting funding from anyone and to jump too soon to accept money from an investor. I think what you're really looking for is an investor who's aligned with what you want to achieve, because you're really going to be in it for the long haul. If you're working together in biotech, you could be with that investor for 10 or 15 years before you're getting out. And you need to be able to talk to that investor when things are hard, and to be able to have an honest conversation with them, and to feel like they've got your back should it come to it. So I would definitely say when you're starting out, be optimistic, be discerning as well. Don't jump to the first investor. Make sure that you're just checking that you're going to be able to work together over a really long period. I'm really lucky, actually. Istesso has got a very supportive lead investor. It's a company called IP Group, which is a FTSE listed company in the UK. They've been incredibly supportive of what we're trying to do, and incredibly ambitious for the company. But certainly when I'm going into a meeting with a new investor, it's in the back of my mind. Will I be able to work with you? Will we be able to have a really open and direct relationship? will I be able to count on you when I need to? Um, and will you be honest in coming to me and saying to me, no, we want to do this way, so that you should be working as a team.
When you think about your trajectory and your career, I'm assuming you didn't know when you got into this field you'd be leading a company like this, that you'd be in the biotech space, but obviously you were open to it. And then when the opportunity came, you seized that moment. So, walk back to your younger self. Let's say as you were starting out in this industry, you kind of had an idea of what you wanted to do, didn't know you'd follow this path. There's probably literally millions of young women out there who are in a similar space in their life and their career, pursuing something in the sciences, in the medical space, in the research space. What advice would you give to your younger self that would prepare you well for the seat you find yourself in today?
I think there's lots of advice I'd have to give to my younger self, including maybe drink a little bit less. Um, I would go back and I would say to her to be bolder, to not always internalize the feedback um, that she might hear from other people about her ideas, to have the courage of her convictions a little bit more and to leap a little bit more. Um, so to be bolder, definitely. I think it's very easy to get hemmed in by potential risks and things that might go wrong. And it takes real guts to follow a big ambition. Um, we can sometimes be too cautious about things that can go wrong. We should really be careful about that, I think.
As you look to the future beyond your field, so we've talked a lot today about immunometabolism and some of the great research there. What is exciting to you in the field of either medical breakthroughs, research among colleagues and peers, even things that your former teammates at GlaxoSmithKlein may be working on to this day? What excites you, and what should we all be thinking about optimistically as potential treatments? We'll say, around the corner.
So, something that's really, really exciting to me is the field of optogenics. So, this is a kind of engineering technique that's being used to uh, really improve treatments for diseases that I think no one thought could be treated in the past. Um, Effectively, what it entails is taking light sensitive proteins and stimulating them to create a biological change. How that's being developed, I can give you a specific example. Um, there was a case, I believe, in the US where a man who had lost his sight received some therapy with optogenics, and they essentially gave him a gene therapy that put this light sensitive protein into his eye, and they started stimulating the protein with the light. And over a period of time, he was actually able to retrain his brain to see from these optogenic proteins, and he regained his sight. That sort of therapy in cases of either congenital blindness or acquired blindness, I think, has profound implications. If you can restore people's sight, it just changes their lives. And there's possibilities that that kind of approach could also work in terms of hearing loss, and who knows what other kinds of conditions on top of that. So I think that's enormously exciting. It's going to completely change the world. Maybe at a similarly exciting, and world-changing is the approval of a new therapy called fusaninotide, which is actually treating menopausal women for hot flushes. Now, that's an absolutely gigantic unmet need. There's probably millions and millions of women who are around the world suffering from that. I think it can be extraordinarily debilitating. And that's the first drug that's coming through that's really going to help them deal with those symptoms. So, also really exciting in a completely different way.
So let me go back to something we talked about earlier about the concept of using stimulating, manipulating your immune system to combat some of the most vexing diseases that we have. It seems so simple in some ways. Obviously, the technology is extremely complicated. But do you feel that this is really where the research needs to go? That for so long it has been about creating pharmaceuticals, creating drugs and treatments that sort of help with the symptoms, but they don't necessarily get at the core of an issue, and that really it is about how we program our immune system to fight better the diseases that so many of us suffer with. Now, I know immunometabolism is a very specific use case, and I know there are
Mhm.
probably other fields that are looking at different applications. But do you feel there is a movement in the research industry to start zoning in on what our own immune system can do when pointed in the right direction and stimulated the right way? And do you think that's really where the focus should be going forward, as opposed to so much of the symptom management that feels like we have been focused on in the past?
I think that's definitely the way that things should go. We should be thinking about how our immune system can alleviate the disease, not how we can control the immune system to stop the disease in the way that we classically think of it. So it's an enormous bugbear of mine when looking at existing drugs for autoimmune diseases that, as you said, Brian, they really do only control your symptoms, and they don't do that well. So these drugs can put a patient into something that's called remission. And I think to a normal member of the public, remission would mean no disease. But actually, if you've got an autoimmune disease, I'm going to circle back to rheumatoid arthritis again as an example. You can be in remission according to your rheumatologist, but you can still have 3 or 4 swollen joints that are causing you pain in your hands. Now, to me, not having rheumatoid arthritis, to have 3 or 4 swollen joints would actually be extraordinarily debilitating. That's not a remission. That's just a bit less disease than I had before. That focus on treating symptoms stops progress. We stop thinking about what is causing the underlying disease and whether we can fix it. And as an industry, as a community of drug discoverers and developers, we need to think more deeply about the best way to help patients. I don't think it's good enough to say it's fine for you to have a few symptoms. We should be aiming for the cure. And if we aim for that, we might be able to get halfway, and one day we will get there. If we're just focusing on getting one less swollen joint every time we make a new drug, we're holding people back from living proper, full lives. We're holding ourselves back from scientific progress. I'm not sure if it'd be overstating it, but it really makes me quite annoyed.
Yeah, it's the definition of cured, right? I think everybody has a slightly
Yeah.
different. There's a scientific definition, if you will. But then there's the everyday person dealing with the symptoms, as you said. And so when you think about the industry, the business, though, when something comes out that is, let's call it an advancement in symptom treatment, but not necessarily a cure, like you said, a drug that might allow you to live a better life, but you are still dealing with complex symptoms.
Mhm.
Does it slow down or even stop other research that might be in the space because now all the funding is going to be cut off for that? Is that how it works in the industry, or is there still a push to do better and better once we have the first of what would hopefully be a series of treatments for a disease?
Yeah, so actually there's a limited pot of money available, and everyone knows that if you go after something that we already know controls symptoms, but you try and do it slightly better, that it's going to work. So that will get a disproportionate amount of funding because people can see that there's a way that can be done. And actually, from a regulatory perspective as well, that's been done before. Everyone can understand we're just going to reduce your symptoms by a little bit more. If you say to people, I want to do this completely different thing, I want to cure patients, whether it's an investor or a regulator, they say, oh, but how? And they can't see through the path that you need to take to do that. There's an automatic barrier there. And I think that's actually not uncommon when you're trying to think differently in any field of science. So yes, I would say that a focus on incremental improvement does hold back really disruptive science. On the other hand, putting an investment hat on, I suppose one can see why it would. It's just, I don't think the best thing for patients. And really, that's why we're gunning really hard at Istesso to be able to show the difference that this approach can make. That should bring those barriers down, I think, and maybe equalize. It will create the possibility of something different.
We always, I think, at least have to bring up the concept of, the business model that large and medium-sized companies, for that matter, have. Once they have a drug in market, of course, they want to protect that patent, and of course, they want that to continue to increase in its sales, even if it is all for the right reasons of trying to treat patients. Have you seen examples of, or have you experienced any of the established science behind some treatments or medications that actually try to slow or stop research like what you're doing that would be really pursuing a cure? This gets into the land of maybe conspiratorial stuff, so I don't want to drift too far down that road. But there has to be some element of the community where there's profits on the line, there's revenue on the line. They're going to throw darts at things that might displace their product. I think that's a very natural part of capitalism and business. Is that a real phenomenon that people like yourself have to consider as you pursue your interests, or is it more of just the natural questioning of any research? And once you prove on, through your scientific research, it will put to rest some of that potential skepticism.
Yeah, so I haven't experienced anything conspiratorial myself. From my perspective, it's more of a kind of to and fro scientific debates. It's a kind of natural um, and healthy skepticism until a concept is proven. And, it's the mark of a good scientist, really, I think, to be skeptical until you have hard data. But we just have to temper that skepticism with a little bit of optimism and a little bit of thought um, for what could be, for the world of possibility, I think. But no, definitely, I haven't experienced anything conspiratorial yet.
And when you think about the risks and benefits of any new treatment, so we talked about all the potential, even of what you're all working on. So often it seems like the regulatory agencies, for all the right reasons, hold back until they have enough safety data. But at what point is enough safety data enough to at least proceed with limited availability for maybe patients who are in an advanced stage of their disease? I think one thing that's been enlightening to me over the last several years, going through the COVID pandemic, was how quickly we were able to get some of those treatments to market because we were all very conscious of this horrible virus and what it was doing to people, and anything we could do to help, we were going to move mountains to do it. And yet we don't do that for other equally complicated issues, whether it's cancer or heart disease or serious disorders. Do you feel like we need to have a little more urgency in that approval process, not to cut corners, not to reduce safety, but just to give the same kind of emphasis to these other major diseases that we did to an emergency like the COVID pandemic?
It's very easy to be on the outside and to look in and say, yes, I don't see why this can't be done more quickly. But actually, when you think about the amount of information that the regulators have to review to feel really confident in approving a drug, it's enormous. I mean, it can be 4 or 5 feet tall if printed out. And that has to be gone through in minute detail. I think that if a regulator missed information and then misapproved a drug that then caused issues, we'd all be very, very concerned about that. So there's a balance, isn't there, to be struck between the urgency of getting something approved, but also making sure that people's safety is protected. And, I really stand by the Hippocratic oath there that we should not be doing any harm even if it takes a little bit longer to get people better. The number one thing is to not make anything worse.
No question. And the other side of that coin, as you said, is you don't want things to go out that are harmful to anybody, even in small numbers. Here in the United States, well, I think one of the key issues over the last 10 or 20 years has been, opioid treatments and so forth that then led to a series of addictions, right? And then there were serious questions raised after the fact about the quality of some of that research and whether that should have been gone through in more detail. So I do think for
Mhm.
every progress we've had a setback, and that makes the public skeptical, and then it makes it harder for the next major innovation to actually get across the finish line because now there's public skepticism on top of it. So point well taken. You've been very generous with your time. I always like to wrap up by asking our guests to look forward into their crystal ball, 20, 25 years down the road. Maybe these are hopes and aspirations, but do you believe that we are going to have true cures to some of the most vexing autoimmune diseases and cancers in the next couple of decades? So within, our lifetime and the lifetime of most people in our audiences, do you have that level of optimism? Or maybe you see other innovations down the road that are even better than that?
I'm reminded of a scene from Star Trek 4, which is the Voyage Home. No, is it the Voyage? Yes, it's the Voyage Home. And in that movie, Dr. McCoy goes into a hospital from the 1980s, sees a lady with kidney failure, and gives her a pill. And you see her a few minutes later, and she's saying, "Doctor gave me a pill, and I grew a new kidney." What our research at Istesso tells me is that although we're not there yet, in the near future, I certainly hope so by the end of my lifetime, we might be seeing treatments that cause enough repair that patients with autoimmune disease can feel cured. And I think that's eminently feasible. And I would love to see that in my lifetime. I'm certain I will.
That's a very hopeful note to wrap up our interview today. Lisa Patel, thank you for joining us. Your website, if folks would like to learn more about Istesso and your work.
Yep, please come and visit us at www.istesso.co.uk.
Fantastic. Thank you for the time. We'll be posting this show across all of our favorite podcast distributors. We'll be making sure that we put a link to that website in the description. And if anybody's interested, are you on LinkedIn as well for folks to follow?
I am. People can find me at LinkedIn/drug discoverer.
Fantastic. Lisa Patel, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
One of the reasons that I started this program was to inspire. And if you're not inspired after listening to Lisa Patel in that interview, then I don't know that I know how to inspire you, because what you just heard was an individual who is committed to helping others and has dedicated their professional career to it. They have dedicated enormous amounts of professional risk. They have dedicated endless hours, their own reputations in many ways, all in the quest of helping others with hard to treat diseases like rheumatoid arthritis or other autoimmune disorders. And it takes a special person to commit themselves to that. And I hope you all are inspired in some small way that whatever it is you do in your life to help others, if you're the leader of a business or an aspiring leader of a business, I would ask you to listen to that interview again and listen to the conviction in Lisa's voice. Listen to the passion that she has for helping others. And how often in that interview did you hear her say the word I or me? It was always about the team, what we're doing, how we're doing it, what we're doing to help, but most of it was focused on others. She has the purpose of her convictions at the core of everything that she does. And when you think about the potential impact of the research that her team is doing and the kind of quality of life improvements that they might be able to deliver if these treatments prove out to be as beneficial as they seem to be at this stage of the trial. So there's a long way to go. We don't want to raise any false hopes for people, but it should be inspiring to you to know that there's an entire community of Lisa Patels out there that are dedicating their lives to the treatment of difficult to treat diseases of people in all ages, from all backgrounds. And there's a potential. The technology appears to be there. The research is there. Innovative thinking is there. And a lot of good people are spending a lot of valuable time trying to make the world a healthier place and ensure that those who are stricken with diseases can live full, happy, and healthy lives after their diagnosis. I would also say that one of our objectives in this program is to show you what's on the cutting edge of innovation across all forms of industry. And this is one of many. What I really want to emphasize is that this is the tip of the iceberg. There are dozens and dozens of exciting clinical trials all over the world that are seeking to treat any number of previously untreatable, incurable disorders. And of course, the biggest headline of all, medical research all over the world has been the treatment of cancer, and there has been tremendous progress in this. People who are diagnosed with all forms of cancer have such a better prognosis today than they have had 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 35 years ago. And it takes an interview like this, and it takes a moment like now to step back and realize how much progress we have made, how many diseases and cancer diagnoses were death sentences at one time and are now conditions that can be managed and potentially, with researchers like Lisa and her team, potentially even cured if we dare to dream. And I appreciated the notes of optimism towards the end of the interview where Lisa emphasized that we don't just think we can get to a day with cures, we know we can. There are many inspiring interviews like this in our podcast series, and we look forward to more. And I'm looking forward to an interview that's coming up next week on the program, which is a different area of research and a different area of the medical space. But we're going to be joined by Lucy Jung. She's the founder and CEO of Charco Neurotech, which is a medtech startup that's developed a non-invasive device to ease the mobility symptoms for Parkinson's sufferers. So another one of these disorders that is very difficult to treat and has afflicted many families around the world. And there's exciting developments on that front, and there's so many things we're going to try to cover in that time with Lucy. So we encourage you to join us next week for that program. As I said earlier, I hope you will go back and listen to this program again. I think there was a lot of complex conversations. There's a few things in there I need to go back and listen to a second and third time to make sure I fully absorbed. And you can do that anytime. Make sure that you visit my website, brianjmatos.com, where we post our full episodes as well as show notes in case you missed key points of the conversation. You can find us on any of your favorite podcast distribution sites, whether it's Spotify. You can find us on the Apple Podcasts through your iPhone or your iPad. You can find us on Odyssey, on iHeartRadio. You can find us on any of your favorite sites, and we post links to some of those in the show notes. You can reach out to me if there's questions you have, or if you were inspired by this episode, you want to hear more like this. Maybe you even have a question you'd like to convey, and you don't want to reach out directly to Lisa. You can reach out to me at info at brianjmatos.com. You can also find me on Twitter at brianjmatos. We post these episodes every Monday so that you can have direct access to them through your Twitter accounts. You can find me on Facebook. I'm at brian.matos. Instagram, we try to get videos up there, video clips, video preview clips at Brian J. Matos. And then I have a YouTube channel as well where we will post preview clips of interviews like this. It's at Brian J. Matos Podcast. If you're on YouTube and you go to the search bar, you can just search Brian J. Matos, find my channel, subscribe, and anytime we post a preview link, you can be the first to see it. And it'll give you a sense of what we've talked about that episode. And if you like what you hear, we always link to the full episode in the show description. As always, appreciate you for taking time to listen to this program. I hope you were as inspired as I was. We look forward to being joined next week by Lucy Chung. And in the meantime, as always, I ask you all to stay curious.